We believe that being a defender requires more than building shooting skills on a range. It's also a development of the heart, mind, body, and spirit. Join us as we explore what it truly means to be a defender in your training and in your everyday life. Welcome to Defenders Live. This is Laura Thorson, and you're watching Defenders Live. Welcome to the show tonight. Thank you for attending. Adam Winch, the founder of Defenders USA, is behind the scenes tonight, and he may pop in from time to time. We never know for sure, but he is here working behind the scenes. If you want to learn more about Defenders USA, about Adam or me or any of the other instructors there, go to defenders-usa.com. So let's welcome Chris to the show. Chris Seipert is of Citizens Defense Research, and he is a retired Green Beret with vast medical and threat mitigation experience from multiple deployments overseas. Now he works hard to translate his experience and lessons learned into the civilian self-protection context in order to help lawfully armed citizens better protect themselves and their loved ones. So let's bring Chris Seipert on. Hello, Chris. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Laura. It's very, very good to be here. It's a tremendous privilege to be on with y'all, and I'm excited. And hopefully we get into some interesting stuff today.
I think we will. And, I'm pretty sure that introduction didn't do you justice whatsoever, Chris. So would you mind giving us your background for those that don't know you?
Yeah, of course. So I was born and raised in Texas. I joined the Army a year before 9/11, which was a good or a bad time to join the Army, depending on what you wanted to get out of it. And so, yeah, I found myself in Afghanistan in 2001, found myself in Iraq in 2003. And I didn't plan on being a lifer, but I just kind of stuck with it. And I found my way into the special operations community. I spent the majority of my career as a Special Forces medical sergeant or a Green Beret. Obviously, all Green Berets are shooters first, and then they have their specialty, and mine was medicine. I also got to do during my career, I got to do a lot of unique stuff, not just the combat zone stuff that everybody thinks of when they think of special operators, but also, I got to do a whole lot of just interesting and unique things working, in and around embassies and doing training missions and stuff like that. So I had a very diverse career. And then a couple of years ago in 2020, I hit my 20-year mark, retired, so I could spend some time with the family. And ever since then, I've been with Citizens Defense Research, training, primarily lawfully armed civilians, and been having a good time doing it, and don't really want to stop anytime soon. So that's what I'm all about.
That's awesome. We love that. So why did you choose to, when you retired, why did you choose to train civilians? And also, what advice would you give to students looking for good training?
Okay, so for myself, one of the things, people talk about different units within special operations. People talk about, like, I was a Green Beret, talk about Navy SEALs and, Army Rangers and Marine Raiders, of course, and all the different special operations elements out there, AFSOC and so forth. And really, people always want to talk about who's better, at this and that, or whatever. It's different tools in the toolbox. Like for different mission sets, there's different organizations. And so Green Berets, Special Forces, primarily what we do is teach. For those, and I was not in the unit yet. I didn't get to Fifth Special Forces Group until about a year later. But for those people that remember back in 2001, the American soldiers, Special Forces guys that were on horseback with the Northern Alliance fighting against the Taliban, that's what Green Berets do. Like link up with friendly partners we want to work with, and then help teach and advise them specifically, so that instead of sending 10,000 Americans or 20,000 or 100,000 Americans, we can send a few hundred Green Berets who can link up with our local partners and get work done with a lot more economy of force, as we call it. And so I spent most of my career teaching. I'm an Arabic speaker. At one point in time, I was pretty good. Every day I'm retired, I get worse and worse. But yeah, I spent most of my career teaching our foreign partners how to do the things that they needed to know how to do to accomplish our joint mission, and doing it in a foreign language. And then I was privileged at the end of my career, right before I retired. I spent 3 years in our Special Warfare Center. Also, I was teaching an advanced skills course for already qualified Green Berets, Navy SEALs, and Marine Raiders. And I just love to teach. I frankly, I probably get more enjoyment out of facilitating the success of others than I do, succeeding on my own. When you can take somebody from where they are to where they want to be and see them accomplish their goals, it's tremendously rewarding. And So when I retired, like I said, I love teaching. I'm actually working on my teaching, like a Bachelor of Arts in History, along with a teacher certification, so that one day when I'm no longer relevant to this field, I'll end up being like a full-time high school history teacher and ball coach, because I just like making people better. And as far as what you want to look for in a trainer, when you're seeking training, I think I think the first thing that I look for is specificity and transparency in their background, because typically people who don't need to inflate or remain vague and ambiguous about their background don't. That if you look at, even like Uber commandos like Pat McNamara or Paul Howe, guys with those backgrounds, they'll tell you like, hey, here's where I was, here's what I did. I know Paul Howe literally provided a DD-214 upon request, saying, I'm not making this up, this is really who I am, as opposed to vague claims of spec ops or, security contracting. Like, what does that mean? So people should be pretty transparent, and that doesn't mean that somebody has to have a background like that to be a trainer. That,
Right.
by all means, that anybody can seek training, get really good at something, and then learn how to impart that to others and do that. But yeah, I look for people that are very, very specific and concrete in their claims about their background, their expertise. They'll tell you not just I train special ops, but like, cool, who have you trained under? Who have you
Hmm.
learned from? Like, kind of what instructor tree do you fall under? So
Hmm.
that's number one. And number two is I look for people that, as I'm talking to primarily an audience of private citizens, I'm looking for somebody who can help me with my current mission. Like, if somebody was great with like hostage rescue in the Mediterranean on a boat, that's awesome. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to take my 4-year-old to gymnastics, and I'm going to be doing the high school pickup line to pick up my daughter from
Hmm.
after school or whatever. And that's the kind of scenarios that I need to be prepared for. So if you're looking for serious self-defense, there's nothing wrong with range fun as long as it's safe. But if you're looking to get better at self-defense, I'm looking for people who are tailoring their message specifically to my needs and my mission as a private citizen, which is what I am now.
Right, absolutely. And that ties in with something I wanted to talk about, defining your mission, which I heard you speak on another podcast about. Could you go into what that means and how that can help the everyday civilian?
Of course. So the one of the unique things about mine, and not just the career of any like special forces soldier, Green Beret, but and mine particularly, even amongst that community, is that we tend to be the Swiss Army knife of special operations. And whereas some organizations will do like back to back to back deployments doing the exact same thing, um, I think only once out of like 14 deployments in my career went back to the same place doing the same thing on the next trip. It was always something new. And one of the big principles that I learned in the military that is very applicable to civilian life is what we call backwards planning, which is, okay, let's define our mission and the end state we want to achieve and work backwards from there. And for example, just one very specific example, is a lot of people debate about carrying spare ammo and how much spare ammo you should carry.
Mhm.
And certainly, like guys in the military, who are looking at it from purely a military perspective, or law enforcement guys, because like Adam will tell you, and other peace officers tell you that like if they draw their gun, generally somebody's got to go in cuffs. And if it
Mhm.
takes 40 rounds, 60 rounds to put them in cuffs, that's what they got to do. They've got to pursue that fight. Same thing in the military. Like, you ask anybody in the military who's run low on ammo, and they're like, that will never happen to me again. But if you study your mission, which I'll tell you right now, as a private citizen, it is to break contact as soon as humanly possible. Hopefully
Yep.
before a gun comes out of a holster, before rounds
Mhm.
start going off. To avoid, to deter, to recognize, and then hopefully revert back to avoidance or deterrence, and then dominating the fight if it's unavoidable. And so, figuring out what you want to accomplish. And again, for private citizens, I actually think it's pretty easy, which is avoid trouble, deter trouble if you can't avoid it, and recognize it before it's too late. But determining what it is you want to accomplish, and specifically that goes into like, with Citizen Defense Research, my partners John Johnson and Melody Lauer, they're one of their flagship classes they've been teaching for years, since before I joined the company, is called the Armed Parent / Guardian. And it is literally a class designed to solve gun problems when you have people with you who are not armed, for whom you're responsible, whether it be an infant in a baby carrier or your 80-year-old dad who's living with you and isn't quite mentally as sharp as he used to be. And that's why I joined Citizen Defense Research. I took that class because I knew that Green Beret with 9 combat deployments and all this experience and all this training, I realized that so I have a 4-year-old son. And at the time, my wife was pregnant with our now 4-year-old son. And I realized I don't have any specific training that we're if I'm carrying the car carrier out of a Walmart parking lot and all of a sudden somebody rounds the corner, sticks a gun in my face, or I've got
Mm-hmm.
him strapped into the car and then they try to carjack me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't have any specific training on that. So there's a gap in my game. And so what I want to be able to do is solve gun problems when I have my infant, toddler, preschooler present. Now, how do I go about that?
Mm-hmm.
Which is going to go into risk assessment, which is something I'm
Yeah,
very,
that
very
was
big
the
on.
next thing I was going to go into. That's perfect. A perfect segue. Managing and assessing risk in our lives. And that looks different to everybody, right?
Yeah, very much so. Very,
Mm-hmm.
very much so. Um, so I'm very fortunate. I moved back to my hometown. I moved back to where I graduated from high school, and it's a small rural community, outside of the Dallas Fort Worth metroplex. And so the risk profile that I have will be different than, say the night shift RN nurse who works in an inner city, hospital and is getting off work at, in the middle of the night, but early morning, whatever it is. And so we've basically got to size up our own lives. And as it relates to risk assessment, this is something else I stole from my military experience. And it's easy to bash military outcomes. You can say, oh, well, if it works so great, then things would have gone better in the last few wars or whatever. But typically the weakness isn't in the process, it's in the people applying the process and applying it inappropriately. So I really like what I learned in the military about risk management. And the primary methodology is, let me take all the things in the world I might want to worry about, and just brainstorm them, just, kind of word vomit them onto a list on a piece of paper. But then I've got to take them and look at them objectively through the lens of probability and severity. Because, while, for my own experience, IRGC Quds Force, which is a special operations unit from Iran, maybe I made them mad 15 years ago, and they decided to take the revenge and send a hit squad to my house in the middle of the night, and I've got 12 commandos crawling in my windows. That'd be really severe, but it's extremely, extremely, extremely unlikely. So the
Mm-hmm.
amount of time I should devote to that specific problem set is probably way, 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 way less than solving the problem of me pumping gas while trying to deal with a whiny toddler. And then somebody just around the corner sticking a gun in my face and say, hey, man, give me your wallet and your phone. Because that's less severe, certainly, than having a bunch of trained killers, Colombian drug lords or ninjas or whatever coming after you. But it's way, way more likely. And so probability versus severity is the big thing that people really need to assess. Because I think a lot of folks out there in the training community are training for eventualities that are less likely to occur, and maybe
Mm-hmm.
aren't allocating their training time as best they could.
Mm-hmm. And also, I believe that many people are training with one tool in their toolbox when perhaps they should be training with multiple tools for various situations.
Yeah, that's very, very true. The
What are your thoughts
I
on that, Chris?
well, so I've already mentioned the Green Berets being the Swiss Army knife of soft, and one of the pluses and minuses that comes from that is I'll go to a civilian shooting class as a student, and I still try to train very regularly with other trainers, to always be learning. I want to be a better shooter next year than I am this year, and that comes from
Mm-hmm.
seeking outside training. But I'll go to open enrollment classes, and typically, like if I'm training with somebody, the instructor often already knows who I am, and they'll either I'll get made the primary medic, and they'll tell people who I am or whatever, and then we'll start shooting, and there might be 3 or 4 shooters that are better than me. Like I was at a Scott Jedlinski class a few years ago, and I had Bill Blauer standing next to me on the line. So every time I'd shoot a drill, and be like, "Yeah, nailed it," and then Bill would just obliterate me. And a lot of people would be surprised. They'd be like, well, I figured, special forces guy would be like the best shooter on earth. I'm like, nah, man, there's plenty of 60-year-old USPSA shooters that'll destroy me, because in my military career, I'm a pretty good shooter, not to, denigrate my skills, but I had to worry about fitness. I had to worry about decision making. I had to worry about my language skills, uh, empty-handed combatives, less lethal tools. There was a whole spectrum of stuff you got to worry about. But what we've learned, both overseas, my military experiences, and what I firmly believe in the U.S., the continental United States context, is that I'd much rather um, teach somebody to be above average in a number of areas than be really, 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 really good at one thing. And that one
Mhm.
thing is typically, I've got a gun, I'm a really good shooter. Well,
Mhm.
cool. But out of 10 probable violent encounters that you might have, um, I would venture to say the majority of them don't require somebody getting shot
Mhm.
unless you make a bunch of other mistakes in a bunch of other areas, whether it be
Mhm.
decision making or you escalate things or whatever else. So
Mhm.
not only just like, hey, I got a gun and I'm going to solve every problem with a gun, but knowing how to use less lethal tools, knowing how to remain verbally agile and de-escalate situations to where I don't have to pull my gun out.
Right.
I think there's a number of use of force encounters that we see both in law enforcement and in the civilian world, where at the moment the self defender or the peace officer pressed the trigger, they were right in having done so, but there were a number of off ramps prior to that moment
Mhm.
where they didn't have to paint themselves into a corner where their gun was their only solution. And I'll
Mhm.
promise you, both overseas and in this world, if you can avoid pressing the trigger and solve the problem um, without anybody dying, that's usually preferable.
Agreed. And I believe that ties in perfectly with what you call mental agility. So everybody in the firearms industry teaches us how to shoot guns, but very few instructors teach us how to think. And I think that that is lacking in the industry. What is mental agility and how can someone develop it?
Well, so mental agility is simply the ability to think in a rapidly changing situation. And I think we would all agree that violent encounters, use of force encounters, or even dangerous encounters that may or may not become violent are definitely fluid, dynamic situations. Just yesterday, as a matter of fact, I weighed in and commented on an active self protection video. And for those of you that aren't watching active self protection, you should be. Um, where there was basically a fistfight altercation where a guy got sucker punched, and then he was literally walking out the door, and then he kind of changed his mind and was like, "No," and pulled out a gun and shot the guy. And something, and in the comments there was a ton of people who were very black and white on the thing and like, hey, that other guy started it, deserved what he got. And I try to explain to people that as it relates to the law of self-defense, um, violent encounters or dangerous encounters, contentious, whatever you want to call them, are sufficiently fluid that in one specific moment, your use of lethal force may be justified self-defense. And then in another moment, as things change, it may be a manslaughter charge. And then literally a split second later, it may be a murder charge. And people hate that because we all, human beings, myself included, I'm not trashing anybody and I'm painting myself this brush too, but human beings can tend to be intellectually lazy and they like black and white answers.
Mhm.
If this, do this, if this, do that. And it typically doesn't work that way, where that while the guy was sucker punching him, but the guy was about to lose consciousness, the dude was continuing his attack, maybe he pulls his gun and shoots the guy and he's justified because he's like, hey, I was about to lose consciousness. But instead, 30 seconds later, he does the exact same thing. And if they catch the guy, he's probably going to get charged with first degree murder. And so mental agility is the ability to process what's happening in front of you um, the same as you would not under stress, if that makes any sense. That basically you
Mhm.
can still process information. I think a lot of people, they get hit with that stress and suddenly their decision making goes down to that very primal level where they're reacting on emotions. And like, for example, that dude who his jaw hurt, he just gotten sucker punched, the rage took over, and he straight murdered a guy. So mental agility is the ability to think just as clearly under stress or more clearly than you would otherwise. How you develop it, um, as we discussed when we were talking previously, there's just like athleticism or a lot of other genetic components, there's going to be people that were born more mentally agile just naturally. There's going to be people who are not quite as mentally agile, but you can't do anything about that. What you can do is develop the mental agility that you possess. Um, in my opinion, the secret sauce is mental planning, preparation through training, and then applying that training and testing that training under stress. And the more you do that, when I was a paratrooper, I jumped out of airplanes, and you're supposed to, when you do static line parachuting, you're supposed to jump out of the airplane and count to 4,000. And if you get 5,000, 6,000, and you pull your reserve chute because something's gone wrong. Um, it was probably like 12 or 13 jumps before I consciously remember counting to 4,000 because I was basically so amped up jumping out of an airplane. It's going however fast, 100 knots or 120 knots or whatever. And and so I was just like a stressed out mess my first dozen jumps. But then the more you do it, it slows down for you. And then suddenly I was consciously aware of things I'd never been aware of before. So figuring out what you need to plan and preparing for it, and then testing that preparation under stress is really the key to building that mental agility.
And what are some ways that we can train that stress? I mean, very few, at least that I know of, very few courses. I know there's simunition and shoot houses and those kinds of things. Is that what you're referring to, or something else?
That's a large part of it. And I'll be honest with you, frankly, there are some phenomenal force on force instructors and classes out there. There's a lot of bad ones,
Mm-hmm.
because they're not taking into account the mental objectives that we're trying to achieve. Again, they're not starting with the desired end state and working backwards. So, as a general rule, I advocate for, and I need to start, now that I'm retired and I don't get to compete within the military and within my special operations community with my buddies. That I'm a big fan of competition shooting, which, if nothing else, it's not a 1-to-1, but I will tell you that if I'm standing in front of 20 people and I'm shooting a course of fire against someone else, and whoever finishes first is the winner, like is done in some firearms training classes, my stress level a lot of times is considerably higher shooting in front of an audience. And am I going to screw up? Am I going to look like an idiot? Than it was at times in my career when I was in actual fights, overseas. And so I'm a big fan of competition shooting because I think that it um, helps you build the ability to think about what you're doing consciously while your technical skills run on autopilot, what's called automaticity. Some people call it muscle memory. But it's the ability to, when you're having to think about okay, where am I going to go next? I've got this course of fire, the no shoots and all that stuff. That at that point, your grip and your trigger just tend to do what they're going to default to do. So that's one way. Another way, yes, is force on force training. Absolutely. There's a number of folks out there that do it really, really well, like Craig Douglas and, ShivWorks and the ShivWorks Collective. Those guys do a great job of it. And then also, I'm actually a big fan of some form of martial arts or combatives for those who are physically able to do so, that specifically has non-consensual sparring. And Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is one of the easiest ones to find. There's other stuff out there. Krav Maga has there's some quality Krav Maga gyms. There's some Sambo gyms that do really well. But by and large, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has the best quality control that I've found, because even though it's not necessarily a 1-to-1, but when you have somebody laying on top of you and you can't breathe, they're basically kicking the crap out of you, and you've got to
Mm-hmm.
collect yourself and think, what do I do? How am I going to get out of this?
Mm-hmm.
It helps you to apply conscious thought and decision making while under kind of a primal type of stress where you're getting your butt whooped.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, that
those are
makes
some
sense.
primary methods I recommend.
One thing, though, about the competitive shooting is that you already know what your course of fire is before you go into it. Doesn't mean you're not going to be stressed out, but there is a difference between that and an actual everyday situation. You don't know how that's going to go. So again, ties back into that mental agility, being able to think in the moment, which sounds like Brilliant Jiu-Jitsu makes you do a little bit more because you don't know what the other guy's going to do.
Correct. And I don't, and to be clear, there is no, much like when I talked about risk mitigation, there's no silver bullet. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
people will, because again, human beings tend, including myself, we seek the path of least resistance, both physically, cognitively, you name it. And so I want, somebody will come to me and they'll be like, hey, what gun should I buy? And generally what they want is for me to tell them, buy this gun.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But instead, if I say, well, it depends, and I give them a bunch of factors and basically equip them with the tools to make a nuanced decision, sometimes people get frustrated at that.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, when it comes to like risk, a risk assessment or security, if something's not 100% effective, people will be like, oh, well, that's not 100% effective. Well, no, your goal is to take a whole bunch of partial solutions and layer them on top of one another to where you have 500% effectiveness because you've got redundancy. Likewise, the thing I love about competition shooting, whether it be USPSA, IDPA, or other forms of competition shooting, is the fact that typically, even if you see the course of fire and you're having to apply your stage plan, you're having to think about your stage plan and what you're doing and where you're going to reload and making sure you don't shoot the no shoots, which is drawing mental bandwidth away from thinking about your grip, thinking about your trigger
Right.
press, thinking about your reloads. And so again, that's just one partially effective tool in the toolbox, because there's no silver bullet out of all those things I mentioned. If you
Mm-hmm.
want to be your best self, you should be competing some. You should be doing some quality force on force training.
Mm-hmm.
Engaging in some martial arts, and frankly, I think that martial arts with with non-consensual sparring does a great job of building mental toughness. Where even when you're losing, you just stay in the fight and say, well, I've got to go until this is over. So even though I'm basically losing, I got to keep working. And I think that helps with the mindset of staying in the fight, even if it's an armed encounter, where the first time you get grazed by a bullet, you don't just lay down and toss your gun aside and say, well, I quit.
Yeah. And that can be practiced. Yeah, definitely.
Interesting
So,
enough.
yeah,
Oh,
go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. I was going to say, interesting enough, talking about that being practiced, and this is this is just like what I've heard through the grapevine, through the rumor mill, but in military training, for large scale exercises, for a long time, they still use this. They use what's called miles, and miles gear is where everybody's got their duty weapons loaded with blanks, and then there's a laser attached to the weapon, and then you're wearing this like laser tag type harness, and
Mm-hmm.
so if your harness gets hit anywhere by a laser, then the rules of the game are lay down, you're dead. And one of the problems with that is that we figured out is we were, the military was conditioning guys that if you get hit, you lay down, and if you're not dead, you wait for a medic. And that's it. And we're conditioning guys to, if you get hit, you're done. And whereas then in the early 2000s, I remember when simunitions got really, really big, was if you were op 4, if you were the bad guys, helping an ODA or, an element train, if you got a couple solid hits to the torso or the head, you would go down. But if you were the good guys in the scenario, whether you're clearing a building, trying to rescue a hostage, whatever it was, you never ever laid down. If you got shot 27 times in the face, you just stayed in the fight. And not only is it very painful to get shot like that, which is good for corrective training on use of cover and so forth, but it also was conditioning guys. And one of the effects we saw from it was conditioning guys that no matter how many times you get hit, if your limbs are still functioning and you can still move and you can stay in the fight, you should do so. Which
Mm-hmm.
is why I'm a big fan of whether it be airsoft or simunitions or whatever, that the good guy stays in the fight until he's told to stop.
Yeah. Really good stuff tonight, Chris. Thank you so much for coming on. And guys, don't forget to put your questions in the comments for Chris. That it's going to be coming up here before we know it, the Q&A session. So if you have any good questions for Chris or for me or for Adam, we're all available, although I'm pretty sure they'll all be for you, Chris. So will you talk about that study that we talked about? One of the questions I had for you earlier was, can people why do some people just seem to be naturally good at staying cool and calm under stress and others don't? And you talked a little bit about that, but talk about that study that you'd mentioned earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. So, something in excess of 15 years ago, I heard about it a few years after it was published, and I don't have the chapter and verse, so I'm just kind of paraphrasing. But there was a study on dealing with stress, and the study was a study directed at special operations soldiers, but they basically took 3 different groups of people. They took groups of like random civilian normies. Who weren't military law enforcement or anything. Then they took a group of conventional soldiers or service members, like basically, whether it be infantrymen or armor guys or supply or whatever, just people from the military. And then they took special operations soldiers and they measured their basically their cortisol and other stress hormones that basically spike whenever you're hit with stress. And what they found was that civilians, had very, very low levels of like, all the stress hormones, at rest, like what, Colonel Cooper would have called condition white. They were just totally at ease, totally relaxed. Then as part of the study, they would basically scare the crap out of people with a fight or flight type, startle somebody half to death type deal, and then immediately measure their, stress hormone levels, immediately thereafter. And so civilians, started out real low and then spiked really, really, really high. And then they, over time, basically tracked how long it took them to go back to their normal baseline. And it took untrained civilians a very long time to get back to normal, to where they could just, think clearly and hands weren't shaking and all that stuff. Then with the conventional soldiers or conventional service members, they found that they walked around with slightly elevated levels of those stress hormones, like basically just kind of more aware, more keyed up. And then whenever they were introduced to a fight or flight or freeze stimulus, it would spike, but not nearly as much as the untrained civilians. And then it would go back down to normal, considerably faster than the untrained civilians did. Then with the special operations group of people they were studying, they found that those guys tended to walk around, pretty keyed up, pretty switched on, with higher levels of all those kind of stress hormones. Then there was a fairly elevated. Their levels did elevate when they were introduced to a fight or flight stimulus, but not a whole lot, like astronomically less than the civilians or even the conventional service members. And then they went back down to their baseline very quickly. And some researchers, took away from this. Oh, we should test. We should basically test people as part of the selection process and test their cortisol levels and see if, basically we can identify people who are naturally, gifted at dealing with stress. And I don't think that was the message at all. Because to know that was true, you would have had to test those special operators when they were in high school and then test them after years of training. My belief is that specifically the years of training and stress inoculation and being exposed to, fast roping, jumping out of airplanes, combatives, getting into real combat deployments, that exposure over time to either highly realistic simulations or the real thing in some occasions, which unfortunately is generally not available to us as private citizens, that's what allowed them to basically control the elevation of their stress levels and then get back to normal very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's not surprising to me that those results would be that way. But, as concealed carriers, our goal is not to be like special operations guys, but we do need to work on being able to manage that stress a little bit better. And I think you've given us, some ways that we can do that. I don't know that that's touched on a whole lot. I think it's talked about, but very few people, it seems, apply that very well in their training on a regular basis anyway. And so I felt like that needed to be talked about.
A lot of people will look at solutions and basically they don't appreciate how small wins can in the aggregate stack up. And so they're like, well, I don't either have the money or the time to go do force on force training or whatever else. And in I teach a mental agility preparation and planning skills class. It's just an 8-hour seminar and discussion on the mental game. And in it, we talk a great deal about how if you literally just mentally, like as you do your risk assessment, you're like, okay, home invasion, everybody's worried about somebody breaking in the middle of the night. If you just if you know how to do it and you learn how to do it, it's very teachable. That's why I teach a class on it. If you spend 10, 15 minutes working through, how can I address this problem? And that if this happens, then I will do this. And for example, I don't have a home defense plan. I have home defense plans. I have home defense plans for intruders already in the house, intruders trying to force intrusion, middle of the night, and everybody's at home in their beds, versus, middle of the day and I'm sitting on my couch and I'm the only one home, front door, back door. And I have all that, in a mental file folder and a mental catalog to where, God forbid, and it's unlikely, like forced home invasions where, they know you're home and they want to hurt you anyway is actually really rare, fortunately. But if it does happen, I'm not having to start building that mental map from scratch under stress in the moment. Because I can say, if someone starts kicking on the front door, I do A, B, and C. And if nothing else, while doing A, B, and C, if the situation changes, you can flex off of that predetermined plan. And I would say that predetermined mental planning for realistic scenarios is the number one way that you can increase your mental agility in the moment under stress.
That's so valuable. Such good stuff. I appreciate it. I've only got a couple more questions here, guys, and then we're going to go into Q&A. If you guys have any questions for Chris. One of the things we talked about earlier, and it's not really on the topic exactly that you were talking about, but you said there's a paradox in the industry that what sells isn't always what's needed. Could you touch on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So my mental agility planning and preparation skills class, one of the paradoxes of that class is that what I've found is that the people that are aware of the importance of having a strong mental game and strong decision-making processes and the people that have figured out they know what they don't know and they want a framework for building that, sign up for my class. But the reality is the people that need the class the most are the ones that it's an unknown. They don't know what they don't know. They don't know how important that is. And so the paradox is that the people that show up to that class and spend 8 hours with me as we chop it up and have presentations and discussions need the class the least, whereas the people that need it the most typically don't want to sign up. They're out at tactical fantasy camp commando schools doing 4-man room clearing and body armor and a helmet. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but that's not really preparing them for realistic self-defense and realistic civilian self-defense scenarios. And so what sells is the fun stuff. And again, is just like with my 4-year-old, if all he ever ate was Reese's peanut butter cups, that'd be really really bad for him. And there's nothing wrong with some Reese's peanut butter cups, but sometimes you got to eat your vegetables. And so I joke that I'm a fine purveyor of fine vegetables, because I've tried to structure and create teach classes specifically for what people need rather than what's necessarily going to be the most fun.
Yeah.
But the reality of it is that if you want a class to sell, then make it look really cool on social media, come up with really some cool tactical operator name for it, and people are going to sign up. Whereas if you're like, hey, we're going to sit around and talk, talk about problem solving and violent encounters, people are like, wait, I'm not like Aussie repelling while firing my AR-15 one handed. No, you're not, and they don't want to show up. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think it's important for people to be aware that there's nothing wrong with some fun. All right. And I try to have fun on the range. It's not, just drudgery when I'm teaching my live fire classes, but make sure you're balancing out your fun stuff, your like, zombie apocalypse centric class. Make sure you're balancing it out with some stuff that's, again, helps you when you're sitting in the daycare pickup line and all of a sudden some carjacker shows up and tries to drag you out of the car while your toddler's strapped into the back seat.
Right. Yes. Really good. And one last thing I want to go over before we go into Q&A, if we have any questions tonight, is this topic of fitness. Now, when we talked earlier, you were saying something about you were comparing two different people and the type of student you would prefer. Can you dive into that a little bit more so I don't put words
Sure.
into your mouth?
No, so the self-preserve and I really like the term self-preservation because we tend to apply imagined realities to the risks that we face. And so going back to my probability versus severity, people will put a whole ton of planning and thought into their active shooter response. If I'm at the mall or if I'm at Walmart and a dude walks in with an AR-15, here's what all I'm going to do. And there's nothing wrong with that. But the reality is, for example, that you're much much more likely to accidentally cut somebody off in traffic, have them follow you to Walmart or the gas station, pull in behind you and start screaming, and have a sublethal, potentially violent encounter. And so that's really what we need to be focused on solving. And again, gunplay may be part of that, but I would rather, that frankly, if you are a USPSA Grandmaster shooter who has a really hard time talking to people, isn't in very good shape, has no combative skills, and can't fight your way out of a wet paper bag, I would go so far as to say that you're poorly equipped to deal with realistic civilian self-defense scenarios. And I would rather have, as a self-preserver or self-defender, I think the person who shoots okay, pretty well, who also has put some time into, they've read verbal judo, they've read how to win friends and influence people, they actually practice verbal interactions with strangers and have some idea how to do that. They've taken managing unknown contacts from guys like Craig Douglas or Chuck Haggard, dudes that teach it. Who also, frankly, fitness is something that we overlook because, again, if we're trying to preserve our lives, I mean, it's just good to be as fit as you possibly can. And what I mean by that is not everybody has to be a triathlete or a CrossFitter or anything like that, but within the constraints of your age and any physical, disabilities or limitations you may have, it does pay to be as fit as you can. I've got heart disease in my family history, where basically everybody in my family that dies of a natural death dies of a massive heart attack. And so it would really be terrible for me to ignore that risk to myself in terms of self-preservation. And then one day down the road, when I'm very unfit, I win my gas pump gunfight with an attempted carjacker and then have a heart attack, while I'm waiting on the police to show up after the fact because the stress was too much for my heart. So looking at the aspects of physical fitness, empty-handed fighting skills, and having something is better than nothing. 5% is better than 0%. Some less than lethal capability, whatever it may be. I'm a big fan of OC and pepper spray. Verbal agility and the ability to talk to people and de-escalate and say, hey, you know what, man, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Here, let me pull this 20 out of my pocket and let me put some gas in your tank.
Mm-hmm.
That if that keeps me from getting into a situation where I've got to shoot somebody, I want to do that. And so thinking about all the other slices of the pie beyond gunplay is hugely important to self-preservation and preservation of your loved ones.
Yeah, and I think part of that managing risk is knowing your abilities, knowing your limitations, knowing your abilities. And there was a video that Adam did just a couple days ago, or maybe it was yesterday, and he talks about that, about knowing your abilities and testing them so that if you're ever in a situation, you'll be able to know those things. And it does talk about fitness a bit, but that's what it boils down to, is being honest about your restrictions, limitations, or abilities, wouldn't you say? That's what it's more about.
Oh, I mean, 100%, because the reality is that, yeah, testing your skills, like, and let's just keep it simple and stick to gunplay. Shooting 100 meter Charlie zone reduced size steel targets. If I'm stone cold and haven't shot in a couple of weeks, I'm an 80 to 90% shooter at 100 meters with a red dot on my full size gun. Okay. Now, what that means for me is if I'm standing in a Walmart and I look 100 yards down across Walmart to the jewelry counter, and some dudes are robbing the jewelry counter, but they're not shooting anybody. It's clear they're like filling up bags with, whatever Walmart jewelry has. I don't know. I know there's a 10 to 20% chance that if I decide to skin my smoke wagon and send a round down there towards them, that I might miss. And then if I miss, the chance that I might hit an innocent bystander. Um, on the other hand, if it's the, God forbid, the El Paso active shooter in Walmart, where I look 100 yards down the aisle of Walmart or Home Depot, and I see a dude who's literally just boom, dead civilian, boom, dead civilian, boom, dead civilian, then in terms of the doctrine of competing harms, in other words, which is the less bad option here, if I do nothing, then people are going to continue to die. So maybe it's worth that 90% chance that I score a hit, or out of 2 rounds, an almost 100% chance that I score a hit. Maybe that's worth the risk. That being said, if you're a private citizen, and don't get me wrong, you definitely need to be focused and proficient at, closer, more typical ranges before you start worrying about shooting at, 75, 100 yards.
Hmm.
But if you don't have any idea what percentage you can hit at 100 yards, you probably shouldn't take that shot.
Hmm.
And so knowing basically how you can perform on demand, cold, under stress, is super, super important. And that's true of, whether it be fitness, combatives, because you may say, hey, look, this cop's fighting with a guy, I'm going to jump in there and I'm going to help this police officer because I want to help, and he's getting beat up. But if you're both out of shape and don't know anything about fighting, you may also put yourself and the officer in a worse situation by either making a mistake or tiring out, or suddenly he's got to worry about protecting you too. So knowing
Yeah.
your capabilities and knowing how much risk you can incur based on your ability level is a hugely important part of keeping yourself out of trouble, both legally and in terms of not putting yourself in a situation biting off more than you can chew.
Hmm. Such good information, Chris. Thank you so much for coming on tonight. Is there anything that you want to leave us with tonight that's really weird? There's no questions. I think that's odd. Maybe everyone's just soaking in everything that you're saying. I'm not sure. But there were so many gold nuggets tonight. Is there anything you want to leave us with?
Yeah, something that we were going to get to if it was organic, and it didn't come up, was Greg Elifritz,
Oh, that's
years ago
right.
now, wrote
Yeah.
wrote an article about an encounter he had with a range. Basically, he was at a public range. Nobody knew who he was. He was just there to train on his own, and it was right after Christmas. And he noticed this young woman who was all by herself, and he made small talk with her. And come to find out, her house had been broken into multiple times. And she'd never fired a gun before in her life. She bought what she could afford, which is a real cheap, crappy, like 380 or 9 millimeter pistol, whatever it was. And that she was bound and determined. She was worried that the robbers were going to come back that night for Christmas presents, and
Hmm.
she was, like, she asked all the guys that she knew if they'd take her to the range and shoot. And everybody kind of blew her off and said, there's no way you can learn to defend yourself in a night or whatever. And Greg, to his credit, said, I can help you. And she was incredibly lucky that
And
she
she
found
didn't even
Greg.
know
And
he was an instructor. He just happened
no,
to be
no
sitting
idea.
next to her.
No, but Greg's lesson and takeaway from that, and we just reshared it recently on our Facebook page from Citizens Defense Research, was that we need to commit. I think it's a great thing to talk about. The first week of January 2023 is, I think we as a community need to focus on inclusiveness, and there's a tendency towards snarkiness and this weird competitive vibe in the shooting community a lot of times, where you can post a video of you shooting and people are going to come out of the woodwork to tell you how much you suck. You can post a picture of a gun and everybody will say what a crappy gun it is, or what a stupid caliber, or whatever else. And I think that we really, really, really need to resolve in 2023 to build a bigger tent and a more inclusive tent. Be kind to one another. When you see somebody at the range has no idea what they're doing, especially if they're being unsafe, offer to help them in the most magnanimous way possible. Try to be somebody who helps and helps solve problems and does it in a kind way, in a way that we act. We act in a manner that makes others proud of the 2A community instead of talking about what a bunch of snarky weirdos and jerks and gatekeepers we all are. And so
Mhm.
I would just encourage folks this year, as you encounter people less experienced or less skilled than you, or maybe have less knowledge about the proper tools or proper techniques, rather than just talking trash, on the internet or making snarky comments, taking photos of them and posting on the internet about how dumb they are, resolve to try to help.
Mhm.
And try to help people and try to make everybody better. Because my goal is to create a so-called, like a herd immunity to violent criminal actors by helping one person at a time, and to where hopefully eventually everybody in our community is sufficiently capable that violent criminal actors decide it's just not worth it anymore.
Yeah.
And the way that we do that is being kind and by helping others.
So well said. So well said, Chris. That reminds me, Adam, did you put all of the information up about we need to make sure that your Instagram, Facebook, and all that stuff gets plugged. It's Citizens Defense Research on Facebook and Instagram, right?
Yep. Yes. And then it's our handle. If you search Citizens Defense Research on Twitter, you'll find us. But it's like CDR_instructors on Twitter, and
Yeah.
we're going to be starting up a YouTube channel eventually. And then our website, citizensdefenseresearch.com, is you can basically, there's a link to our Eventbrite page there. There's all of our instructor bios for all of my fabulous instructors. I do want to point out, yeah, Melody, Melody runs CDR, Melody Lauer, and then John Johnson's a longtime partner there. And we've also added Kurt Clark, K.A. Clark, Caleb Giddings, and one of my favorite dudes on our new team, who's got a lot of great stuff to say, is Ross Hick. And so if you get a chance to train with any of them, I'd highly recommend it. I couldn't be more proud of the team that we built. But yeah, check us out on social media, and love to see you all out at a range or training conference somewhere.